So we're going to start by looking at plant identification, because there's many different plants in the world. Not as many plants as there are insects, but there's certainly a lot of plants out there, and there's no way on this earth you're going to be able to know by heart every single plant out there. That's not what we're really asking you to do. Now, they certainly drilled a lot of plants into me when I was at Auburn, but that was just kind of part of it. So there's no way that you're going to be able to know every single plant in this book. But what I want you guys to be able to do is, if you don't know what the plant is, to be able to identify it. You know, I see a new plant probably once a week. I'm like, what is that? You know, you have to go through the process of figuring out what it is. So we're going to look at that process, how to properly identify a plant. So we're going to introduce a fair amount of terminology here as far as parts of the plant, things to look for. And once again, you know, this is a lot of information, a lot of terminology, but as we go through this class series, I'm going to be using a lot of these terms. So you definitely want to start to become familiar with them. I'll try to re-explain them when I come up on them again. So we'll get started here with plant identification. So essentially, when we are trying to figure out what a plant is, identifying plants, it's really generally a process of elimination. To figure out what a plant is, first, you've got to figure out what it isn't. So if it is if it's a broadleaf looking plant, then it probably isn't a conifer. All right, so you can narrow it down, and you just keep on narrowing it down, working your way down until you kind of have the only option left. So we're going to be looking at specific characteristics of the plant, the habit, the leaf, the stem. Every plant's going to have some sort of difference. That's the reason why we have different species. I mean, they are not all exactly the same. And so we want to understand and know some of these basic plant identification terms. I'll talk a little bit. Sometimes I might use scientific names versus common names. Certainly for this class, you do not need to know the scientific names. So I know all of you other people from Auburn are like, oh, thank goodness. That's probably, you've forgotten some of it, because Lord knows I have, because they made us learn the scientific names. So the difference between scientific and common names is the scientific name is one specific name that the species has, species of plant. We name all living organisms by scientific names. It's decided on by scientists. So if you have a Lagerstroemia indica outside, there's only one species on this earth that is Lagerstroemia indica. Now there might have these subspecies or varieties, but that is crepe myrtle. Whereas common names, that's what people commonly call the plant. So for instance, with the Lagerstroemia, crepe myrtle is the common name. Sometimes plants will have more than one common name. What I call forsythia, my grandmother called yellow bell. Those are both common names, though also the scientific name is forsythia in that sense. Some people might talk about tulip tree. Well, there's two different tulip trees that can go by that name. So that's where you have to be sometimes more specific with scientific names. When it comes to landscape design, especially if you are not going to be involved in the installation process and you are just doing the design, you probably would want to spec your plants using the scientific names so that there is no confusion. As far as writing them, you're not going to need to know that. Like I said, you're not going to need to know scientific names, but there is a set of rules as far as writing them. And in college, once again, they would dock us for that if we didn't do it right. So typically when we are talking about identifying plants, we are looking at the leaves, but also we're looking at things like the bark or the branching structure, the buds of the plant, both the leaf buds, flower buds, the entire plant. Maybe we're looking at the fruit. So we're looking at these different parts of the plant. So some questions you can ask yourself when you're first trying to figure out what is this plant? Well, is it evergreen or deciduous? Evergreen means that the plant is going to be green all year, versus deciduous means that the plant is going to drop its leaves. If it's in the wintertime, that's a fairly easy thing to figure out. If there's leaves on it and it's January, it's probably evergreen. Whereas in the summertime, both evergreen and deciduous plants are going to have leaves on it. So then how do you tell the difference? And sometimes it's hard to tell. But in general, deciduous leaves are going to be thinner, bit more papery. Think about a maple leaf or an oak leaf even, versus an evergreen leaf, which tends to be thicker, and that's how they're able to withstand the cold. So in general, that's kind of how you're going to be able to tell. Also, we will talk a lot about leaf arrangement. You'll get tired of me talking about leaf arrangement. So how the leaves are arranged on the stem. Is it alternate? Is it opposite? Is it whorled? Sometimes the only way you can tell a difference really between two plants, especially if you're not overly familiar with them, is looking at the leaf arrangement, telling the difference between a boxwood and a holly. It comes down to leaf arrangement, or between a holly and an osmanthus, leaf arrangement. We will talk about the leaf margin. The margin is the edge of the leaf. So just like the edge of the page is the margin. You know, you always get red inks in the margin of your papers. So the margin is the edge of the leaf. We'll talk about if it's entire, if it's just one shape, or if it has lobes, or if it has serrations, or spines, or if it's just smooth. So we're going to use those kinds of terms. And also the general plant form. So is it a spreading form? Is it prostate? Is it fastigiate or columnar? And there's actually even a book I'll show you here real quick. This is a plant identification terminology. There is a whole book on just the terminology of identification of plants, and it gets super specific, and we won't get this much. It talks about the different types of flowers and the seeds, and with great little drawings. It's a good little resource. Gets very detailed. So here you can see that top left picture, that would be deciduous versus evergreen. So maybe we don't know specifically what these plants are yet, but I can already break it down into whether it's a plant that loses its leaves in the winter or a plant that does not. And so that's going to rule out one side. We talk about leaf arrangement. There you can see on the right, opposite, you have 2 leaves per node, alternate 1 leaf per node, whorled, you might have 3, and there's even sub-opposite, which actually I have an example I'll be showing you guys later. Here we talk about the margin of the leaves. Here's some of the words that we use. There's entire, undulate, like undulations, like waves. Elaeagnus does that. Or maybe finely serrated, coarsely serrated. There's doubly serrated. Elms will be doubly serrated, and some hollies. Crenate is like little crenellations, like little scallops. Lobes, so those very large cuts like an oak or a maple. Here's some of the different plant form words that we use. Prostrate means close to the ground, or horizontal spreading, or horizontal creeping, or that arching spreading. There's actually quite a few shrubs that we use in the landscape that are naturally an arching spreading type plant. Junipers like gray owls, also loropetalums, forsythias. And sometimes what happens when you have a plant like that, people think it looks unruly, and so then they end up shearing it. And we'll talk about some of that. I've got some rants saved up for you when it comes to plant maintenance and pruning. All right, so also some of the other things that we'll talk about, the bud, plant's bud. And what a bud is, it's a compressed, undeveloped shoot. So it has all the not necessarily stem cells, but the beginnings of that plant creating a new shoot, or maybe it's going to create a flower or next year's stem. Also, some things that we talk about, excuse me, is the node. So the node on the stem, that's the point on the stem where a leaf or a bud comes off. So, and then the space in between the nodes, that's the internode. So you are only going to have buds, flowers, leaves come off on the stem where there is a node. So in between the node, you're never going to have a random leaf shoot off. The genetic differentiation of the cells is not there. So sometimes the nodes are very close together. Sometimes they're pretty far apart. Typically the node, it kind of, even if there's really nothing on it, it might look a little swollen. Typically it's going to have some sort of bud on it, like that picture there. Also, sometimes with some plants, I will identify it or start to narrow it down by looking for lenticels. And what that is, it's kind of like a little mark. It almost looks like some people might even mistake it as damage. It's a little mark, or it's a breathing pore in the skin or bark of a stem. There's, it says stem, I keep needing to fix that. It's supposed to be stem. There are some plants, cherries come to mind, that the lenticels are fairly prominent. You look for them. That's one of the ways that I'm going to identify a cherry tree, actually, because of those little lenticels. It's normal when a plant does it. It's not damage. It's not insect damage. It is a breathing pore. All right, let's look at the leaves. Many different types of leaves, and we talk a lot about the terminology and the different parts of the leaf, and we will use this with identification. So if you have got a simple leaf, just the classic second grade leaf, typically it's going to have a few different parts. It's going to have the blade, which is the flat part of the leaf. Typically it's going to be green. That's where the photosynthesis fun happens. The little stalk or stem, sometimes people will call it a stem, that connects the blade to the stem, that's called the petiole. That's the stalk of the leaf. There are sometimes leaves that do not have a petiole, Mahonia, so that's called sessile. Like I said, the blade is the flat expanded portion of the leaf. Sometimes the petioles are very long. Maples actually have a fairly long petiole in comparison to the blade. And sometimes there'll be certain colors or a certain thickness. And sometimes there are other structures as well. So sometimes on a leaf, you might have what's called a stipule. And it's kind of a little half leaf looking little flap, typically where the petiole meets the stem. Not all leaves are going to have stipules, but if a plant does have stipules, it's one of the things that I look for. Rose is a great example that has a stipule. In fact, that's what that picture is on the top. And the stipule's kind of fused or stuck to the petiole, but it's kind of like a little wings on the edge of the petiole. Sometimes the stipules might be modified into tendrils, like on a clematis or a cucumber plant, or even spines or scales. So a spine, like on a barberry, is kind of a modified stipule. Also, we look for, with a leaf, we look for what's called the axillary bud. And that is the bud that meets where the petiole meets the stem on the node. There is always going to be a little bud there. Sometimes it's more prominent than others. Sometimes you might use that for identification. Sometimes it's almost non-existent. Like even with this picture here, and that is a holly, there is that little small round bulb, and that's the axillary bud. If there is not an axillary bud there, then that might actually not be a leaf, but a leaflet, and it might be a compound leaf. So we'll look at that here in a minute. We look at the leaf arrangement. Like I mentioned, you guys are going to be tired of me talking about leaf arrangement. There are many different types, well, 3 or 4 different types. Mainly we look for alternate, and this is an example of alternate. So you have leaves arranged 1 per node. So on a plant that has an alternate leaf arrangement, you're never going to find 2 leaves on each node. It's always going to be 1. Sometimes it's in this ladder fashion, one's on the left, one's on the right, and one's on the left, and one's on the right. Sometimes it will do that. A lot of our plants will have leaf arrangement alternate, all hollies. And that's also another thing, is it tends to be an entire family of plants that have a certain leaf arrangement. So like all maples, whether it's a silver maple or a sugar maple or a red maple, are going to have opposite leaf arrangement. All hollies are going to have alternate leaf arrangement. Doesn't matter if it's a rotunda holly or a inkberry holly, all hollies are going to have alternate leaf arrangement. Here is opposite. Opposite leaf arrangement is leaves that are arranged 2 per node. Once again, it kind of stays within the family. So all osmanthus, so tea olives and olives, are going to have 2 leaves per node. All hydrangeas are going to be opposite. All maples are going to be opposite. So kind of knowing or being familiar with the family of plants and whether that entire family has opposite or alternate is also going to help you to narrow down what is this plant that you're looking at. Euonymus has opposite. Boxwoods have opposite. And then sometimes you'll run into a couple of more things. Here's whorled. Whorled's fairly easy because whorled's like, it's swirled, whorled. And this is going to be 3 or more per node. There are some plants that they'll be alternate, but then as you get to the end of the stem, they end up becoming more whorled. Alyssum or anise, oleander, which I think is what that is. Azaleas will do that. And then even some hydrangeas, they'll have opposite, and then sometimes I'll find whorled as well. So 3 or more per node is whorled. Pittosporums will tend to be whorled on the ends as well. And here's fascicled. Fascicled is fairly straightforward because you see that and you're like, oh, okay, that's a pine tree. So that's how pine trees arrange their leaves in these little bundles, these little small type bundles, and that's fascicled. So with this pine tree here, you have that little, you pull it off and it's got that little brown bit there, and then you'd have 2 or 3 pine needles. Each needle is a leaf, and that's arranged in a fascicle. When you get to maybe trying to identify different species of pine, sometimes it will talk about the length of the fascicle or how many leaves are in the fascicle. Like a Virginia pine, I believe, has 5 typically leaves per fascicle, whereas a loblolly or a longleaf pine is going to have 3 leaves per fascicle, but we are not going to get into that kind of detail with this class. I'm not going to make you identify like a longleaf pine versus a Scotch pine. I'm not going to be that mean. Like I mentioned, there's different leaf types. We've looked at the simple leaf, and the simple leaf is a blade that's in one piece. It might have twos, it might have serrations, it might be lobed, but it is going to be one piece. There's not little pieces coming off. If you're not sure if something is a leaf versus a leaflet, then look for that axillary bud. If there's an axillary bud where that petiole meets the stem, then that's a leaf. If you're not seeing an axillary bud, it might be a leaflet, especially if you can find on that next branch down that there is an axillary bud, and then it will be a compound leaf. And here is a compound leaf right here. So a compound leaf, the blade, part of the leaf, it's divided all the way to the midrib, which now is called a rachis, into two or more pieces. Sometimes they might be even leaf pinnate compound or odd pinnate compound. Sometimes the leaves will meet almost like opposite, and then sometimes they might not, like in this instance right here. But that entire piece, that's the leaf. So where at the very end of that rachis, where it meets the stem, you see how it's kind of swollen a little bit right there. That's where you're going to find the axillary bud. And once again, certain species or even certain just a general genus of plants might all have compound leaves. So all hickories are going to have a compound leaf. All nandinas are going to have a compound leaf. So there's different types. There's once pinnately compound, so which is like what this one is. That's once pinnately compound. So the leaflets are arranged along that one main axis. There might be an odd number or an even number. I think that is Robinia or Gladitia right there. It doesn't really matter. So that whole thing is one leaf, but visually we read it as many leaves, and sometimes people even get confused. So that's once pinnately compound. Twice pinnately compound is when you like leaflets on your leaflets. So you've got that main rachis, and then it branches into leaflets, and then that branches into leaflets. A great example of this is a mimosa tree, that very fuzzy vase-shaped tree we tend to see in woods. It's kind of almost weedy in a sense. This is little pink flowers. That is a twice pinnately compound leaf. So even though it looks like really little small leaves, and we read it as really small and very fine textured, really the leaf itself is quite big. There can also even be thrice pinnately compound leaves, so leaflets on leaflets on leaflets. Best example of that actually is a nandina. Nandina, actually the leaf is quite large, but it divides itself 3 times. It can get a little intense. Another type of compound leaf, so those are all pinnate. So you have that main axis, that's pinnate. There can also be palmately pinnately compound. So that's where all the leaflets arise from one point at the base of the leaf. That is a Virginia creeper right there. Some people plant it as a lovely plant. Some people see it as a weed. It tends to be weedy at my house. So that whole piece, that whole round piece, that's the whole leaf, but it is palmately. So like a palm of a hand, and that's where the name comes from. So it all originates from one point at the base of the leaf. And there's a few others. 5-leaf akebia does that. Vitex, I think. Also, we will talk about, so that was the leaf blade arrangement, simple leaf versus compound. We will also talk about the leaf venation, how the veins are arranged in the leaf. We can use that for identification. Of course, there's going to be pinnate. So once again, here's pinnate. So you have a main piece, a main midvein, and secondary midveins arise off of it. Like the way that you would draw a little tree in elementary school, and you draw the little stick and little sticks coming off of it. That's pinnate leaf venation. Many of our ornamental plants have that kind of arrangement. Oaks, camellias, like gardenias. I mean, a lot of them. That's an elm right there, I believe. Hollies are going to have a pinnate leaf venation. And one of our, and that's kind of like the default, I guess you could say, is pinnate leaf venation. So sometimes we want to look for if we are not seeing that. If it is pinnate leaf venation, there's still a whole lot of things it can be. Then there's some other types of venation that we'll see as well. So here is palmate venation. So it's just like palmately compound leaves that all originate from one spot. The leaflets originate from one spot. Palmate venation, the veins originate from one spot. So you can have this on a simple leaf, which is what this is right here. That's a maple. As you can see, there is not one main vein. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 7 main veins that come from that central point, and it kind of is, you know, it's lighter. It's almost like a little bullseye, and it originates from that. So maples will do that. Fatsias, and that's going to be one of the things that we will use to identify that. Also, that is a simple leaf. It's not compound. It does have some lobing to it, some serrations. It's another way you can describe that leaf there. There's also parallel leaf venation. So parallel means lines that run next to or parallel each other. They don't cross. So a good example of this is like a lily leaf or any kind of grass bladed leaf, so like a corn leaf, and those veins run parallel down the length of the leaf. Cast iron plant will do that. Also, there's a few broadleaf plants that will do that. Dogwood is one actually that have parallel leaf venation. That's one of the things that I'll actually look for when I'm trying to break it down and see if I can figure out what it is. In general, parallel leaf venation you're going to see with monocots, grasses, though not always. Like I said, dogwood will do it as well. We will also talk about leaf lobing. Lobes are like little rounded structures. There can be a couple different kinds of lobing. Once again, here's that lovely word pinnate, again, pinnately lobed. So that is where all the lobes come off the length of the midline of the leaf. Oak tree is the classic example, and that's what that picture is right there on the top. So you've got lobes following the length of the entire leaf. You've got that pinnate leaf venation, and that's a simple leaf. It has lobes, but it is a simple leaf. It's one leaf. You might also have palmately lobed. Here's our maple leaf again. So you've got all the lobes arise from one point at the base of the leaf. A sweet gum is palmately lobed and also palmately veined. So both of those pictures are simple leaves. They're not compound, but they have lobes. So they are cut. Some people say cut. Japanese maples as well will do that. Now I'll talk about the general shape of the leaf as well. When it comes to the leaf shapes, a lot of these words can vary dependent on the person that's using them. And usually it is related to something like, egg-shaped. People will say it's an egg-shaped or a heart-shaped leaf or an oblong leaf. And there's a bunch of different words. These are just a few of the ones that we see. Some people might describe a leaf as ovate, which if you listen to it, it's like oval, or egg-shaped or oval-shaped. So that first leaf there, which is a holly, is ovate. Some people say obovate, which might mean it's a little bit fatter. Or elliptic, oblong. I tend to use the word lanceolate a lot, which is, I believe that picture top right, kind of lanceolate, like a willow leaf is lanceolate, like a tip of a lance, long and thin. Cordate. Cordate means heart-shaped. Latin, I believe. So you got that wider part that's at the bottom of the leaf. A catalpa tree is cordate, or an eastern redbud has that cordate or heart-shaped leaf. Sometimes we even say linear, so maybe a very long, thin leaf, like a lot of grass blade leaves are linear. And there's many different leaf shapes, and kind of when it comes to leaf shapes, this is kind of the best way you can describe it. You might describe a fan-shaped leaf. Looks like a fan, like a ginkgo. We talk about the margins of the leaf, the edges. If we say the margin is entire, that means it's smooth. No lobes, no teeth, no serrations, no bumps. It's smooth. It might be stiff, like that holly right there, and it does have that one point at the end, but that is a smooth margin. Also, we might say that the margins are serrated, or serrate, like a steak knife, a serrated steak knife. It has little sharp teeth like that. You just took a little pencil and so for instance, once again, here is our Virginia creeper down there, which we know is compound. It's palmately compound, though the leaflets themselves have pinnate venation and the margins are serrated. So there we can already start to use our terminology here to describe that leaf, and that helps us to identify what it is not. We might also say that it is doubly serrate. So serrations on serrations. So you have got big big serration, smaller serration, big serration, smaller serration. It's almost like you did the big serrations, then you came back and did smaller serrations on top. That's doubly serrate. A lot of elms will do that, which I believe is what that is right there. Also, some hollies, Emily Brunner, Mary Nell in particular will do that, have that double serration. We might also say that the margin is crenate, or it's crenellated, and that is little rounded teeth. So it's not sharp. It's like the way you draw a cloud. Some hollies are like that, and that's what that picture is right there. That is probably a Japanese holly that have crenate. Also, Indian hawthorn has a crenated margin. It's a fun one to look for. The margins can be lobed. We talked about lobing. You can have pinnately lobed. You can have palmately lobed. So the leaf is divided into different sections, even though the leaf itself is entire. So here, there's our oak. It's lobed. The margin is lobed. That one on the bottom there, that's a ginkgo. It's lobed. It has two fan-shaped lobes, and it kind of even really has a little bit of crenellation. Also, if you look at it, look at the venation. If you can see, that is parallel leaf venation. It's not a network of veins. They're all parallel. So that'd be another way to describe it. There's a couple other leaf types. Certainly when you get into the conifers, there is an awl-shaped leaf, an awl like an ice pick. It's very point. So an awl-shaped leaf tapers to a stiff point. Juniper is a great classic example of some of the awl-shaped leaves, though also Cryptomeria has an awl-shaped leaf, and a few other conifers. We might also talk about a scale type leaf, which is a lot like a scale on a fish. It's a little short leaf that it tapers and it lies close to the stem. Once again, juniper will have this. You can see it there on the bottom. Scales, they tend to be a little softer. Awls are kind of sticking out and away from the stem, and they're pointed. Scales taper in close. So Arbovita will have a scale type leaf. Sometimes you will have a plant and it has both awl and scale type leaves on the same plant. It's a juvenile versus mature foliage. Some junipers do that, and the new leaves will be scale type, and then the older leaves might be awl type, and it'll be on the same plant, which can be kind of interesting. All right, so all of this terminology that we've used, let's put it all together. Let's say we've got this plant here. Here's a picture of the leaf close up, and we've got the whole plant right here. So if we look at it, we have figured out maybe it's January. So we figured out it's evergreen. So we know it's evergreen, so that's going to rule out all of our deciduous plants. Now, if we look at the leaf arrangement, you can kind of see it in that picture. We have got an alternate leaf arrangement. That's going to be typically the first or second thing I'm looking for. So you have a leaf, then a leaf, then a leaf. If we look at the leaf itself, we can say it's a simple leaf. So it's not compound, it's a simple leaf. We look at the leaf venation, it's pinnate. You've got that main mid vein with smaller veins coming off of it. We also look at the leaf margin, the edge of the leaf. It's crenellated. It has that little scalloped edge. In general, the form of the plant, it's what you call like a mounded, rounded form. And then perhaps you might look at some of the other characteristics. For instance, with this one, we've got red berries. So, we can use that for identification. There's some plants that don't produce berries. Also, if you look at the stems, they kind of have a gray color. In this instance, we might also use that to figure out what this plant is. And so knowing all of this, even if once again, you still aren't sure what the name is, you can even just take some of these and Google it, and you might end up getting the plant that you're looking for. In this instance, we put it all together and we can figure it out that it is a type of holly. And in this instance, it is a dwarf Yaupon holly. And the more you deal with plants and the more that you work on identifying them, the easier it gets, I promise you, to where eventually you get to a point where you can just look at like maybe that bottom picture and be like, oh yeah, that's a dwarf Yaupon. You're not quite sure why, but you just know it is. But we all have to start somewhere, and we all start with just trying to figure out, okay, is it evergreen or deciduous? Is it got a crenellated margin, or if it's serrated or entire? So the more we use this terminology, the better off we're going to get at figuring out what this plant is. All right, and that is that slide set. So close this here. What we can do real quick, we can take a quick 5-minute break. It's 5 till 9. So we'll come right back at 9 o'clock and then get started on the next thing. Any questions on that so far? Y'all feel free to chime in. You need me to go back over anything? I'm up for it.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, let's get back started here. What I'm going to do next is I have actually yesterday, because today was rainy, so I went ahead yesterday and recorded a few videos of some of the plant materials that I've actually got here at my yard. So I've got a couple of different videos to show you guys. I'll start with the first one. I kind of go through some of the different trees as far as we're kind of still right now in the morning. We're going to stick with the plant materials side of things. So once again, this is about to be, I'm about to throw a lot of information at you guys. Thankfully, like I said, you'll be able to go back and rewatch this stuff and, try to learn some of this. And once again, don't feel like that you've got to learn like every single tree species that I go over here. I just kind of want you guys to generally be familiar with the terminology and also in general what you probably will run into as far as ornamental plant material and things like that. So, and some of these are, so can everybody see that screen? Y'all good? Okay, I'm gonna hit play and you should be able to hear it all right. So let me know, like wave at me if you're not hearing it. All right, we are going to start with some trees this morning, look at some of the different types, what we will run into, how to identify them. Let's start with the oaks. This tree right here with the kind of whitish bark is actually a white oak. He's not the best specimen. He's kind of been in the woods. He's crowded, but this is a white oak. And I have got some leaves right here. So this is a type of white oak leaf. Now this one might actually not be from this white oak. I think this might be a blackjack or something, but all white oaks are going to have smooth lobed margins on their leaf. So you see you've got these different lobes, these little cuts, but they're rounded. There are no points to them. So a lot of our white oaks fall into this category, things like water oak, blackjack oak, white oak, overcup oak, are all going to be types of white oaks. So this is our white oak. Our red oak, which I've got one over there, but let me show you the leaves real quick so you can compare. This is a type of red oak. So you've got the lobed leaves, but this time there are points, what you call a bristle tip. You can kind of see there. See how it's pointed? And it even has, if you look at it up close, it's got a little bristle of hair. It's not sharp, but it is there. So this is a type of red oak. This might be a southern red oak, so things like willow oaks, shoemart oaks, nuttall oaks, pin oaks, those are all going to be types of red oaks. Most of our oaks are native to the southeast. There are some that aren't. They're native to England. Most of them are also deciduous, which means they drop their leaves every year, though there are some evergreen ones. Live oak is one, laurel oak is evergreen. But for the most part, they're going to be deciduous trees, typically found natively. Sometimes we do plant these, especially a lot of the red oaks. The white oaks tend to develop a taproot, so that makes them hard to transplant as they get older. All oaks produce acorns, some bigger than others. In landscaping and in landscape design, we tend to want to use oaks that have smaller acorns so that it's not so much of a liability issue. People don't get pelted on the head. They can be, you can trip like marbles. So pretty much for the most part, we are looking for smaller acorned oaks, like an overcup is a great choice, or also nuttall, pin. But something like a bur oak, which makes an acorn like 2 inches around, can be an issue. Another tree that we will find natively in the southeast is hickories. There's many different types of hickories. This is one right here. And actually a pecan tree is a type of hickory. Hickory has compound leaves, and this is one of the compound leaves right here. It's missing 2 of the leaflets right there. Odd pinnately compound, so it's going to have this one leaflet at the end. Hickory also has a particular smell. It smells like hickory. You know, we use it for cooking. Hickory wood, build things out of hickory. It's very distinctive. Native, typically you're going to find these already native because they do not transplant well. You're not going to buy a hickory and plant it. You're going to come up on one already sprouted. So it's a pretty nice tree. They can get messy. They can drop their hickory nuts everywhere. So here are some of the nuts right here, the hickory nut. Huge, so these can be messy. Squirrels like them, so good for wildlife. I think people can eat them, but they're pretty bitter, but you know, is a thing. Pecans, of course, we do eat. That is a type of hickory nut that we do eat. And as far as value in the landscape hickories, fall color is really nice. They typically have a nice yellow fall color right around Halloween, at least in this part where I'm in 8A, zone 8A. Good shade trees. Because they're native, they're pretty tolerant of a lot of the things that the Southeast has to offer as far as humidity, heat, nice bark, but they can get a little weedy. They like to grow, they like to sprout, so you know, you'll get a lot of little sprouted hickories in the springtime because the squirrels have planted the hickory nuts to save for later and then they lose them. So they can be, as far as maintenance goes, sometimes you are pulling up a lot of little hickory seedlings. One more native tree that we will talk about is a sweet gum tree. Here is one right here. It's a little, you can see it's pretty tenacious. This thing used to be a huge tree, then it died, and then it's re-sprouted itself. These are pretty tough trees here. Native to the Southeast. The main way you're going to identify this one by the leaf. It has got these 5 pointed lobes, and also if you look at it, it is actually very finely serrated along the margin. Palmately venated leaves, so you see all the main veins come out of the middle of the leaf there. This is like, for those of you 80s kids like me, this is like the tree star leaf from Land Before Time. This is that leaf. Sweet gums natively have actually, once again, very nice fall color, it can get red. They can have a nice red fall color. Very tough, very prolific, very good at reseeding themselves. I've got quite a few sweet gums in my backyard, and every spring I end up having to pull up little sweet gum seedlings out of my front yard because they're very good at reseeding themselves. And that's another way to identify them, actually, is their seed pod. Here are the seed pods, the sweet gum pods. These lovely little things, I'm sure we've all stepped on one as kids. They hurt. They tend to fall mainly around autumn, though they can get knocked down any time of year. Every once in a while I actually find one that's still kind of green that gets knocked down after a storm. So these things are very good at reseeding themselves. These little things can hurt. This one's been down a while, so it's actually kind of soft as far as sweet gum pods go, but you can just see there's a bunch of them right in this area right here. Here is one of my larger sweet gum trees, is this guy. He's actually one of the tallest trees on my property, and he gives me some pretty good shade, especially in the afternoon, because it's not my favorite tree, but you know, he's here, he's native, and he's happy. And let's look at some maples. Here is a Japanese maple. I have a couple on my property. This is a green leaf variety. As far as Japanese maples, all maples have opposite leaf arrangements. You can look, see how there's 2 leaves that hit the node on the stem. 2 leaves, 2 leaves, 2 leaves. That's opposite leaf venation. So that's one of the prime identifying characteristics of all maples. Red maples, silver maples, sugar maples, they all do it. This one's Japanese maple. And the main way I'm going to identify a Japanese maple is if you look at the leaf, it has lobed leaves, palmately lobed venation, and they have, the little lobes are palmately arranged as well. So with some other maples, red maples, they're not quite as cut as this. You can see you got serrated edges. This one has got 2, 4, 8 or 9 different lobed fingers. Very lacy, and there's many different varieties. There are some that can be extremely lacy. Typically the more what you call cut of the leaf, typically the more expensive and the slower growing. Japanese maples are a slow grower for maples. Some can grow fairly fast, like Bloodgood. There's also some red lead varieties like Bloodgood. I don't have one on my property. As far as landscape characteristics, what this one adds to the landscape, certainly the texture. This very nice, we call a finer textured leaf. It's kind of feathery. It can look very feathery, especially as the tree gets older. This one's a pretty young sapling here still. Fall color, wonderful fall color. Most maples do have a good fall color. It can range anywhere from yellows to oranges to reds. Most Japanese maples are going to be oranges to reds in fall color. And there's some that will be red all year. They do lose their leaves. They are deciduous. All maples are deciduous. But one of the nice things for landscape value with this plant is even when it doesn't have any leaves, especially the older plants, it has a nice, what you call it, architecture. of the branches. So you can light it up at night, and it kind of has this really nice open vase-shaped habit. Even without leaves, it can be pretty distinguishing in the landscape. Very soft. A lot of our maples are native, like some native red maples, silver maples. It's almost too hot here for sugar maples, really. So they tolerate our subtropical climate very well. They do have a few pests. Japanese beetles, in particular, really like to eat on maples. There's a bark scale. And another problem sometimes is the bark of maples is pretty thin. I mean, you can see here it's actually green. Even older maples, it's very, very thin bark. So sometimes, like, the sun can burn it, especially the afternoon sun coming from the southwest. You can get a southwest sun scald on some maples, some red maples in particular. So that's one thing that you'll be aware of if you start seeing a burnt or a deteriorating area on the side of one of the bark. It's probably that abiotic issue, that too much sun in the afternoon. And here's the other Japanese maple I have. This is a Sango Kaku Japanese maple, or coral bark Japanese maple. So you can see the characteristics are a lot like the other one we were looking at. This leaf is not as cut, not as dissected, not as lobed. This one has 5 lobes. The petiole, that part that connects the leaf blade to the stem, is red. This one is also a green-leaved Japanese maple. He gets, I guess it's a he. Beautiful kind of an orangey red fall color. You can see also this one's older, so it's got that really nice structure, the bones, so to speak, of the tree trunk. So even in the wintertime, when there is no leaves, it's still a very nice specimen tree. I've got him here on the side of my house. Another thing I'll point out, actually, just while we're looking at it, is what Fred has talked about, and I'll talk about, that trees do not heal, they seal. And that is what is happening here. This is where a branch was. About 5 or 6 years ago, one of my kids pulled it off. They were hanging on it, and I freaked out, but the tree is slowly healing over this area. And probably what was wrong, the branch was weak in the first place. It had a narrow crotch angle and a lot of occluded bark, and that made it weak, so it just snapped right off. But you can see it's slowly healing over this. It's a pretty large wound. Been doing pretty good. For a little while there, I thought I was going to lose it. And of course, I've got to talk about this tree. This is actually my favorite type of tree. This is a ginkgo right here. It's fairly new. I still got it staked, actually. Planted him this spring. I've got 2. Ginkgo is a very unusual tree. He's just very unique. He is actually a conifer, and this I can say he. It's a conifer, so he's more closely related to pine trees, juniper, than a broadleafed plant. Some people call it a living fossil. These have been around a long time, evolutionarily speaking, so he's kind of outgrown a lot of his pests. Very easy to identify because of this leaf. This is a fan-shaped leaf. Sometimes it'll be dissected into 2 lobes, kind of like that one right there. It's got that little notch. The leaf venation, if you can see it, it's parallel, so it kind of runs down the length of the leaf blade. And ginkgos are dioecious, so I can say this is a he. This is a male tree. The females produce the fruit, and when it comes to ginkgos, it's really gross, stinky, like rancid butter. So if you're going to plant a ginkgo in the landscape, do not plant a seedling. You want to get a named variety. It's going to be male. And typically, like if you plant a seedling, sometimes it takes like 10 or 20 years before it finally produces fruit or flowers. So it's hard, you cannot identify whether it's male or female as a seedling. You have to kind of wait 20 years, and by then you're kind of committed. So this is why you want to plant a named variety only in your landscape designs. This one is, I believe, Golden Globe. The variety, there's one called Gold Spire that's pretty nice, that's a little bit more fastigiate or upright. Very tolerant of sun, drought, heat, pollution. Great street tree. Because of the way the leaves gather close to the main stem, this is not a very branchy plant. The way it covers like this, so as this tree gets older, it's a shade tree, but it still allows a fair amount of light underneath. You can actually have it in areas where there's other plants or grass, and it's going to do all right. Here's my other ginkgo tree right here. One other thing I'll point out about ginkgos when it comes to maintenance, that's another thing that makes this tree a great tree. It will drop its leaves in the fall. It is a deciduous tree, but it drops its leaves in the course of about a couple of days. So it's a one-time cleanup. You're not picking up leaves all winter. So we like that in the maintenance world. Also, the fall color is lovely. It's a very bright yellow. Here's another tree I've got that I have planted. This is bald cypress. Once again, this is a seedling little tree. I just planted him this spring. This is a conifer, so it's actually, you know, like the ginkgo, it's a conifer. It's very soft. It looks feathery, very nice texture, foliage. And the way you're going to identify this when it has these very leafy, fuzzy, soft leaves here. A very almost a reddish brown bark that kind of exfoliates as it gets older. You can kind of see here it's kind of peeling, exfoliating. Pretty fast grower too, and that's nice. It's called a bald cypress because it actually does drop its leaves in the fall, so it is a deciduous conifer, so they do exist. So it will drop its leaves in the fall. Fall color is really not much to call home about. It's just kind of a brownish fall color, but it does have a nice habit in the wintertime. It's a X-current tree, so it's got this very strong central leader. Deals with some pests like a lot of conifers. In fact, I just noticed here I've got this little bag here. If you look really up close, I don't know how well it's going to show up on camera, but there's actually some little caterpillars in here, so I'm going to have to cut this off. I'm not exactly sure. It's like a type of tent caterpillar of some sort, so I'm just going to trim that here in a little bit. Fairly tolerant, fairly easy to grow. Not too many pests. Of course, then we have this right there. One of the things about this plant, if you plant it where there's a fair amount of water, so like in almost a swampier area, it will get the roots, the surface roots will kind of come up out of the surface and get what you call knees. The more water, the more knees, and that can be kind of a trip hazard, liability hazard. This one probably isn't going to do that because it's on a high and dry slope, gets a fair amount of sun here. And look at this guy here. I know this doesn't look like a tree. It is a sapling. I just planted him this spring. This is an eastern redbud. So it is a tree native to the southeast. You probably notice this tree in early spring, and it gets, before the leaves come out, it gets these little bright, light purple, very small flowers over the entire tree. And because it's native, you see it a lot in the woods, like along the side of the interstate, and it's very showy then. It's very beautiful. Then after that, and it gets these little heart-shaped leaves. This is a heart-shaped or cordate leaf. And then it's just pretty much green for the rest of the growing season. You don't really notice it after that. There are some varieties that have a redder leaf. Forest pansy, I believe, is one. This is just a regular green leaf version. As far as identification, one of the main giveaways for me is this heart-shaped or cordate leaf. There are a few different plants that have that. Catalpa is one, but the size of this one, it's about 3 inches this way and that way. Also, once again, look at the venation, just like the maples, it has this palmate venation of the leaf, which you can also see here on the other side. It's a small tree, so it's going to be at most maybe 15 to 20 feet or so. Has a habit, kind of like a vase-shaped habit, a lot like a dogwood, and blooms around the same time as a dogwood. It is actually a legume. It's related to peas, which if you grow peas, it's a very similar leaf, and it does actually produce, mine hasn't done it yet, these little seed pods that look like a little pea, and that's because it's related. The flowers are actually edible. You can eat them. People put them on salads. Fall color, kind of a yellowish to an orange. It's not the most showy fall color. The main landscape value for this one is those purple flowers in early spring, and then after that you kind of want him to fade into the background and have some other things that are going to be of interest. So it's kind of like an azalea in that sense. He's kind of I don't want to say a one-trick pony, but that's kind of the main thing that he'll do, and then has some other things around that's going to be interesting the rest of the year. And of course, what would a southern landscape be if you did not have a crepe myrtle? Probably most of us know this tree. Some of us probably hate it and curse its name, but like it or lump it, it is going to be a part of the southern landscape for years and years, hopefully. They are not native. They're actually native to China and Japan. A lot of the plants that live in China and Japan natively actually do pretty well here. It's a very similar climate. So this is a crepe myrtle. This is a purple-leaved, purple-flowered variety. I believe it's called Catawba. And there's many different color types. There's pinks, there's reds, there's certainly whites. You're just not going to get like a blue. You're not going to get an all yellow. As far as identification goes, if you look at the leaf, let's see here. It's kind of a nondescript leaf, really. There's no serrations or anything. It has an entire margin. Pinnate leaf venation. One of the things to look for actually is the leaf arrangement on the stem, because this is one that was actually what we would call subopposite. You can kind of see it here. So you've got a leaf, and then this leaf it's kind of opposite, but not quite. It's that subopposite. See how they're not quite lined up? Crepe myrtles will do that. Sometimes loropetalums as well is another, and then sometimes it'll look more alternate, like this one right there. Deciduous, so it's going to drop its leaves in the winter. They do have respectable fall color, yellows to oranges. There's a few reds. It just kind of depends on the weather. As far as the habit, a lot of times you're going to see them as a multi-trunked tree, like this one right here, which probably has a few too many, but that's just how it was when I got it. Sometimes you will see a single trunk, and that's called a standard. And it has a vase-shaped habit. All crepe myrtles are going to do that, like this. I can actually see one across the way at my neighbor's house that needs good pruning. Not like crepe myrtle though, and that's actually one thing I'll talk about. Poor crepe myrtles are abused in the landscape, and people for some reason think that at the end of winter that they need to come in at about right here and cut this whole branch off and cut everything down here, right? We've all seen it, and that's crepe myrtle, because these are not trees meant to be hacked back like that. They're meant to be trees. I mean, look at these awesome branching structures that we've got in here. Now, I'm not saying don't prune it, because they can get very sticky. Like as far as a lot of the little bitty stems, you can kind of see it on the end. All these little bitty, that's a stem, that's a stem, that's a stem. I mean, they're all little sticky stems. At the end of winter, I would probably prune some of these smaller ones off, but I'm never going to cut anything that's thicker than my pinky finger. Unless it's a diseased branch or something like that. So let it be a tree. Let it have a high habit. Let it be natural. And if you let it grow, you'll end up with a very beautiful tree. A lot of people hate crepe myrtles because they just look like little sticks with a little pom-pom on top, and that's because of a bad pruning practice. I mean, if you let these trees go, they can get, I mean, the natches will